Good evening. This is the December 12th meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. And I want to start out on behalf of the mayor, who has given us a Christmas gift. You might see some of us chewing on things during this meeting. He sent us a card that says, "We wish you and yours the merriest of holidays. Thanks for the good job you all do. Bill," from the mayor, city council, and employees of the city of Moscow. So our popcorn and candy.
We're really special.
This is one of the perks of serving on a commission, you know? So, anyway, so thank you, Bill, for sharing that. Okay, well, we have Kurt Obermeyer joining us by phone, and everybody else you see is present. Okay, so we'll begin with item 1, approval of the minutes from November 28th, 2018. Anybody have any additions, corrections, deletions?
You.
Good.
Make a motion we approve.
Dennis, motions, and Victoria, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. And we move on to correspondence. Is there any correspondence from staff? Okay, and I should add that Bill Belknap is filling in for Mike Ray tonight as well. So now the Transportation Commission meeting report.
Transportation Commission, I reported on the last meeting. Our next meeting is tomorrow between 4 and 6 in this room. A couple of interesting items. One is there'll be a discussion by Mr. Palmer on a bike share program, which is always an interesting discussion.
Oh, yeah. And is that public-wide or just city staff? Or
well, I'm not quite sure what all. All I have is the title on the agenda.
Okay.
If I might, just provide a little background. So the University of Idaho has been pursuing the establishment of a bike share program on campus, and that would also be community-wide as well. They had a vendor that they thought last summer lined up for the beginning of the fall semester of this year. That vendor pulled out kind of at the last minute, so they've been evaluating other potential vendors to provide that service. They identified a company, I think they're looking at, trying to recall, was it 50 or 100 bikes? I think I've heard a couple different numbers to start the program off with. And I'm sure Tyler will be giving an update on that. It'd be a dockless e-bikes. I think they're looking at whether it's at 50 or 100, they would be dockless e-bikes that provide electric assist. And then you could subscribe to their service. I think students would get a certain amount of usage free every month, and then other community members could sign up with an account to use the bikes.
Okay. Thank you. Sounds exciting.
I was going to follow that up a little bit. We were up in Spokane a couple of weeks ago, and Spokane was going through a 4 or 5 week demonstration placement of scooters, and we did see a moderate number of scooters in the couple of days we were up there, and we did see a few of them left in awkward places, like the middle of the sidewalk. So that's one of the problems that has not yet been resolved. Apparently, the reports were that the Spokane was fairly pleased with the results. They reported the company apparently reported a small number of injuries, but it's not necessarily corresponding to the results that were observed from the emergency room. So there's some controversy over that. The other item of interest, which Bill may know more about, is that there's some design alternatives, I guess, on the Mountain View end of the 3rd Street project. Bill, do you know any more about that?
I think they're going to bring that to the commission to solicit the commission's input on whether that bicycle pedestrian bridge that the council directed staff to get installed in that location be located in the middle of the right-of-way, or whether it be on the north side of the roadway where the two-way bike lane will be located. I think part of it revolves around the removal of parking. And as you get to that dead-end street, there's like 2 houses at the end of the road, and the question, I think, was whether they would end the two-way bike lane in advance of that last little end, and then they would put the pedestrian bridge in the middle of the street, center of the roadway, rather than pushing it to the north and having to remove parking along the north side when there's such low volumes in the 2 dead-end segments of Mountain View. There are some benefits and there are some pros and cons in both options. If you put it on the north side, then that creates some grade issues with driveways that are fairly close to get the approach up to the pedestrian bridge. Whereas if they place it in the middle of the roadway, then it helps alleviate impacts to adjacent sidewalks and driveways for the time being until the permanent bridge, if the council decides to move forward and install that at some point in the future. So they're going to look for some input from the Transportation Commission, and that'll go to the City Council to decide where they want to place it.
So will, I guess, those options be available online to look at, do you think? Or?
I don't think they have any designs that have been completed. I think it's just more of a quick pro and cons of the two locations. And given the fact that this is intended to be a temporary placement, maybe it makes sense to go ahead and put it in the middle and not have to do extensive concrete work with driveways and sidewalks for it to be removed in the future. Or maybe it's best to actually get it to where it's supposed to be in the future and put it on the north side. So I think there's going to evaluate really the pros and cons of each option there. But since it's somewhat temporary in nature, I think they're just evaluating that, but I don't know that they have any detailed designs at this point.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
Just an add-on to the bicycle. It seems like it's just kind of taken over the country. I was dumbfounded when we were in New York in May for a week to have bikes, green bikes, all over the city. It was pretty surprising because New York is less easy to ride bikes in than you might think. And then we were just this week in Charlotte, North Carolina, and again the scooters are there.
How'd they
And
do in
so
the
I
snow?
was dumbfounded to see scooters kind of lying here, there, and everywhere. I guess you put your credit card into it, and I don't know exactly how it works, but there were quite a number of young people fleeting around town, so it does seem like it's a now thing.
Yeah, and most of us operate through an app, and you scan the device and it unlocks it for you, and you are now in possession of that use, and you start to get charged for it, and you're charged until you
I see.
check it
Yeah.
back in. So most of that is all.
I did not use one. I was happy to just be walking.
Great. Anything else, Joel? Okay, thank you. Item 4, public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the audience or public to come in and speak to us about matters that aren't on our agenda tonight or pending before us. Do you have anything you'd like to say in our audience? No? Okay. Item 5. Bill's going to give a presentation on the area of impact agreement draft, or I suppose it's more than a draft at this point.
Excuse me, I think I just swallowed my cough drop. So you're correct. Tonight we are having a public hearing on the proposed amendment to the Area City Impact Agreement between the City of Moscow and Latah County. Idaho Code does require the establishment of an Area City Impact that provides for the adoption of the comprehensive plan and the land use ordinances that are to apply within the area. The location of the Area City Impact is generally guided by trade areas, geographic features, areas reasonably expected to be annexed to the city in the future. So those are really three guiding principles for the location of the Area City Impact. And the agreement as well, as I mentioned, dictates what comprehensive plans and ordinances would apply within the area. That can be a combination of the county's plans and ordinances, could be the city's plans and ordinances, or it could be some other combination thereof. The code directs that the Area City Impact Agreements be reviewed every 10 years to determine if it's in renegotiations or in the best interests of both parties, and mutually agreed upon negotiations can follow any process and time frame as may be mutually agreeable between the two parties. The last Area City Impact Agreement was approved in 2006, so it's now approaching about that 12-year age. Within it, it adopted the city's 1999 comp plan, zoning, subdivision, mobile home, and RV park ordinances. Establishes a process for both the administrative requests, quasi-judicial applications, so those being the specific land use applications, inspections, and process for addressing potential zoning complaints within the area. We began the discussion of renegotiation between the city and the county in 2015. And much of that, at that point in time, related to a code amendment the county was considering that was increasing the ability to divide land in the Ag Forest District throughout the county. At that point in time, it was decided to wait until the city's zoning code and comprehensive plan updates were completed and before we move forward with the formal amendment to the agreement. We were approached by the county earlier this year with a desire to move forward with updating it because of the age of the ACI agreement. Additionally, we had the significant zoning code updates that occurred earlier this year, and there were some potential benefits to area city impact residents to have those codes in place in the area city impact. So the county wished to move forward with amendments of the agreement this fall and now into winter. So just to provide a little bit of background, the map here, the gray area is the current city limit boundary, and the green line is the boundary of the area city impact. This illustrates the zoning designations within the area city impact, and the light green shade is the ag forest zone. So just about almost 88% of the area city impact is zoned ag forest, and that had been probably one of the primary concerns of the county was that we had adopted in '99 the county's old ag forest zoning district. The county had since updated the ag forest zone, and they were administering essentially two different ag forest zoning districts with different regulations and standards within the area city impact and outside. So one of their primary objectives in the process was to have the city adopt their current ag forest zone for the area city impact to ease administration and to ensure that residents and property owners both within and outside the area city impact were being administered underneath the same standards and regulations of the ag forest district. The proposed agreement for 2018 would adopt the city's comprehensive plan as adopted in 2009, accepting the land use map. And so they are suggesting to adopt the current land use map that the commission has worked to develop for the update that's occurring right now. But that would be the comp plan that would apply within the area city impact. The largest component of the comp plan that really has much force and effect in the area city impact is that future land use map. So what they're suggesting to adopt would be what we are planning to have the council adopt and would have the most impact within the area. They would also adopt, as I mentioned, that updated 2018 comp plan land use map. They would adopt the city's current subdivision, mobile home, RV park ordinances with some modifications. They did not wish to have any fee in lieu provisions because they generally don't do that in their development, and that's a situation where there may be some public improvements that have to be completed, but there's an option that the developer may pay a fee for those improvements rather than actually constructing them. The county typically does not engage in those activities, and so they wish not to have any of those within the area city impact. They would just require any required improvements to be completed. The city zoning ordinance would also be adopted with a few modifications. They would delete our nonconformity sections so they could rely upon the county's nonconformity sections as they've adopted. They wish to utilize their existing flood hazard area code. Our codes are very similar, but just for consistency of their interpretation and application of the code, they would like to have their flood hazard area code apply within the area, so that would be that would apply. They really don't do planned unit developments. They had some in the past, and they don't anticipate any happening in the area city impact, so that chapter of the zoning code would be deleted. So property within the area city impact would not be eligible for planned unit development. If it was on the edge of the city, then they just need to be annexed in to receive the services and to do a PUD. But the county did not wish to process any PUDs within the area city impact. They also had some minor amendments to the sign code that related to regulation of signages based on their content, and that relates to the Reed case recently. They wanted to avoid any potential litigation they may face because of that, so they had a few minor changes to the sign code as it would apply within the area city impact. They also wish to adopt the city's animals and fowl regulations that actually are within Title 10 of the city code that are in the police regulations. So we make reference in the zoning code to those animal regulations in the police regulations, and if those aren't adopted within the area city impact, then obviously it would not have force and effect, so they wish to include that within the adoption. We would then adopt the county's ag forest zoning district with a few minor changes. One would be to delete salvage, wrecking, and junkyards. occurring outside a fully enclosed building as a conditionally permitted use. We just didn't anticipate seeing that in the area city impact and didn't necessarily feel that would be an appropriate use in that location. The animal husbandry and all uses normally associated, I think they wanted to add that into our farm, ranch, and outdoor recreation just to make sure that that was an allowable use in that designation. We would modify theirs. I think you can have up to 250 animal units by right within the county's Ag 4 zone because it's generally applied in more rural areas. And then if you want to exceed that animal unit number, you have to get a conditional use permit for the county. So we would just reduce that number down to 50 animal units within the area city impact, just to, not that I think it would happen, but just to avoid the feedlot right on the edge of a rolling hills or residential neighborhood in the Ag 4 zone. So it still allows reasonable animal use, but scales it down a little bit in that close proximity to the city. We would also modify or retain our current 40-acre minimum parcel size within the area city impact. And one of our primary concerns about the regulation of your land use or division of property close to the city is to avoid the fragmentation into 2, 3, 4, 5 acres that then inhibits the city's ability to extend utilities and roadways in an efficient manner. So we would maintain the current 40-acre parcel size requirement that currently exists within the Ag Forest District that we have adopted currently for the area city impact. We would retain, and that does allow a one division of at least 1 acre in size from an existing 40-acre parcel. So we would retain that, so we're not diminishing any property owner's rights to create a new parcel from an existing parcel of 40 acres, so that right would exist. We did introduce the language that the county currently utilizes in their land division process. So when you're in the county, and if you're going to do a land division and you have a 100-acre parcel and you want to create a new 20-acre parcel, you're required to designate a no more than 2-acre building site. And that building site location is guided based upon trying to avoid impact on productive ag lands or riparian areas or flood zones or other natural areas. And so the county is trying to move the home site locations away from those sensitive areas and to only have a 2-acre area designated for as a building site, and that allows the protection and preservation of the remainder of the property. So we would retain that language that no matter what the size of the division they would be creating, that they would have to have that 2-acre building site identified as part of their division process. We retain pretty much all the language that exists in the county's zoning code for that division. We did also allow for the logical extension of existing and planned roadways to ensure that natural resources are protected and the city of Moscow can grow in an efficient and logical and orderly manner. So it does allow us to have input into a division of property and the location of a building site to make sure it doesn't block maybe a major roadway that might be extended in the future as a consideration. As I mentioned, we would maintain the county's non-conforming use regulations, floodplain ordinance, and they also wanted to maintain their county design standards for private driveways. So we would include that as well. The Idaho County Planning Commission conducted a public hearing on this as well on December 4th and recommended approval of the agreement to the Board of County Commissioners. So we are here to hold that hearing to provide that recommendation to the City Council. And so I would be happy to try to answer any questions you might have before the hearing.
Any commissioners have any questions for Bill? Joel?
One thing I noticed in here, which may have been there before and I hadn't noticed, section 4, where proposals within 3/4 of a mile, but outside the area of city impact are at least forwarded to the city for information. Has that always been there?
That is new, actually. I did not include that in the overview. I forgot that. So we had a discussion about the boundary and whether there would be any need to expand the boundary of the area city impact. And we have actually annexed very little property over the last decade. We've had more infill development in town, whether it's Rolling Hills or Southgate or Indian Hills or other developments. Most of that's been happening largely within the city limits, and very little property has been annexed. Probably the Logos property has been the largest annexation we've had in about the last 10 years. We ultimately decided it used to be fairly important to have property in the area city impact, because if it was not in the area city impact, cities could not annex the property. state statutes were modified to allow a voluntary annexation to extend beyond the area city impact. So now it becomes less important, and we don't, the city really has not, to my knowledge, used forced annexation and typically does not. Usually only annexes property when a property owner is requesting it because they're either developing the property or they need to receive city services because a well or septic system may have failed. So for us, in doing voluntary annexations, it really doesn't matter whether it's in the area city impact or not. And there are two benefits to area city impact, the first of which is the same or very similar development standards are required in the area city impact as is in the city. So there's continuity between the zoning regulations and land use and the development requirements. But the second is that the city has an opportunity to provide comment upon an application or proposed development in the area city impact. So we felt we were adequately covered with the current boundary for the code applications. The only benefit we thought we might have is an opportunity to provide comment on applications that may be outside the boundary. And if we could provide another means of providing input onto an application, and it happens very, very rarely, that they would provide us to do that, an opportunity to do that if it was within 3/4 of a mile of the city limits. So rather than amending the boundary and some of the hard feelings that creates on property owners that would not wish to be in the area city impact, just an additional opportunity to provide comment was identified as being kind of a solution to address that issue.
I guess that makes sense since any comments that we make in the area city impact are advisory, and any comments we'd make in the area outside that, but within 3/4 of a mile would still be advisory.
It'd be all advisory, correct?
Yeah.
No, yeah.
So,
I
okay.
presume
did you?
that our relationship is reasonable with the county these days. I don't see many county people here tonight in case for a discussion, but I wondered if you could just, for our benefit, give a sense, how are other cities in the region or in the state of how's this area of impact thing, is everybody across the state looking at it in the same way, or do you have any report on issues that have come up?
Every jurisdiction is different, and it comes down to the relationship between the cities and the counties. And area city impacts are not always, the most smooth point of discussion between the two jurisdictions. I think historically we've had a very good relationship with the county. We've worked very well with staff, both at the staff level as well as the city council and the board of county commissioners, with multiple projects we work on jointly together. So for us, it's actually been a fairly smooth process. But it just varies in how cities and counties administer it and how they apply regulations and how well they work together in the area city impacts does vary widely across the state. There was a report that was completed here now almost about 6 or 7 years ago where they evaluated how area city impacts were administered between various cities throughout the course of the state of Idaho between cities and counties. And really it's all across the board of how they work, and it just ultimately comes down to the individual relationships between the two entities.
It just seems to me as I drive through southern Idaho a couple times a year, the Magic Valley and Burley area, there's so much more industrial stuff going on.
Right.
It would seem to me that it could be significantly different than what we see here. We don't see a lot of agriculture industry. You don't see smokestacks and big things everywhere. So I was just curious to.
And in the areas of high population growth, high urban centers tend to see the higher level of conflict because of the annexation actions and the friction between the cities and the counties, or because you see higher density residential developments being proposed in surrounding rural areas in the county. So we just have had such a consistent and steady but somewhat modest 1% population growth, and most of our new development has been happening inside the city limits, that it just hasn't raised to the level of causing any type of conflict. The primary concern in the past has been the ring road, and as you recall, we've had that, I know Mike's had that discussion with the thoroughfare plan modifications from the Transportation Commission, as well as the transportation study that indicated that it was not, the benefits that we'd receive would not appear to justify the cost of building such a facility. And so that modification was made in the comp plan and in that future land use plan that they're adopting as part of this to try to avoid that concern. And it really was the eastern segment of that. So that oftentimes was a large point of contention within the area city impact. And now that that has been analyzed and has been modified and or removed from the plan, I think that's helped as well.
Anybody else? I have a question for you in terms of if somebody wanted to do a plan unit development in the area of city impact, they would have to first go through an annexation process? Is that how it would work out?
Correct. And it's not, I don't think the county would anticipate, or nor do they really wish to promote development in the county itself. They have held kind of a long belief that if you're going to do a development of modest or high density, that it needs to be within the city where it can receive adequate services. If they've adopted a position where they would appeal any substantial water right application from any private development. So they really feel that if there's a project that needs a PUD or is going to have that kind of density, it needs to be in the city. And so they just felt that they did not wish to entertain that type of application in the area city impact. So if there was a property that was adjacent to the city limits that we could reasonably annex, then they would have to annex a property in order to do that.
Because I was thinking we're going to be talking about the subdivision ordinance next year, and concepts like conservation subdivisions fit better on greenfield development than they do as infill usually. So that I was wondering what the implications.
Yeah, and I think the county's position is, and if you look at it, the area city impact, I mean, just going back to the map, it does not extend very far outside the city limit boundary. So we're not talking about a large area. I mean, the kind of the trail property is the largest piece that's in the area city impact. That's probably well positioned for future development. As you go up North Polk, we have that whole fragmentation issue really up the whole corridor that really inhibits much happening farther to the north because there's been so much division of property up that corridor that to extend services and utilities that could support a project would be very costly because of the offsite extensions. In the northwest quadrant, you have the large university holdings in North Farm that really is where utility services need to come up that basin, up the Farm Road corridor, that are probably going to largely inhibit that. So we don't have a lot of great opportunity in the northwest quadrant of town. And we have kind of similar issues in the southeast, where the university land holdings and just the topography mean that we really don't have sanitary sewer service down in that side, that quadrant, and that's why the area city impact boundary has been up to the city limit boundary for many years. Probably the south, and along the east, and kind of the northeast are the likely areas of growth. And in many areas, it's within, a couple hundred feet from the city limit boundary after the recent Logos annexation. These other areas, it's maybe 600 to 900 feet. So, if it's a planned unit development, it's likely going to be something that will be annexed in the city so it can receive utility services.
So it's pretty strict, or it's pretty clear that there's not an absolute specific dimension of, say, a quarter of a mile or something anymore. It's kind of a feel your way.
Yeah, and you may recall it was much larger prior to 2003, and there's a long history of it being much larger, and the city playing a final decider role in land use applications that was deemed to be unconstitutional with respect to the Blaha case.
Right.
The reaction to that between the county and the city at that point in time was to shrink the area city impact dramatically, and so this is the boundary we've essentially resulted from that process. But we really haven't grown anywhere other than just about out here to get any closer to that boundary, and we anticipate we have 5 to 10 years of lot supply easily within in the city limit boundary that we don't feel is really necessary to extend that dramatically. So that additional notification process was kind of what we came up with as an opportunity just to, we don't think we need to go through the turmoil of expanding the boundary. If you just give us an opportunity to provide any comment on applications that they don't normally see, rezones or subdivision plat or something that's a higher intensity.
Thank you, Bill. Anybody else have any questions for Bill before we open up the public hearing? Okay. Did you have any more comments, Bill? No. All right, so we'll open up the public hearing, and would the one person in the audience like to come and make comments on at all, either in favor or against, or questions? All right, barring any other persons present, I believe we will close the public hearing. And now we have, I guess, final questions for Bill, or anybody want to make a motion, or?
Wendy?
Yes.
I pointed out too, and there's a couple formatting little glitches in here, but I pointed them out to her.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. So that's all square, so we'll just, whoever makes the motion can say including the typographical or whatever.
I will move that we, I guess we would recommend to council the approval of this with the Scrivener's corrections.
Right.
So I move that.
Thank you, Joel. Is there a second?
Second.
Victoria, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And we don't need anything beyond this because
No
this
reason
is
statement.
legislative.
Correct,
So, right.
correct.
Okay. So, thank you. We'll move on to item 6, which is a final review of the comprehensive plan update. And what I believe Bill will be talking to you about is, or us about, is sort of the public comments and what the response that we went through the public comments at our last meeting and kind of what came out of that, what actions needed to be taken, et cetera. So we'll turn it over to you,
Thank
Bill.
you, Madam Chair. So I believe at the last meeting, Mike walked through all the comments that were received during the public comment period.
We had received them ahead and sort of scanned through them because there were quite a few. And then we topically, I guess, and according to each contributor went through them. And so I think, yeah.
So I think in response to that discussion at the last meeting, Mike went through what he felt was the direction of the commission. Or there were, I think, some items that the commission agreed to, some that they left up to his discretion, whether it was just wording choices or what have you. So we'll kind of walk through the changes that he's made to the document, just so you can be keyed on that. So I do have kind of the individual's last name that made the comment. So the first of which was from, I think, Ms. Irving, who requested the removal of a tentative future roadway alignment on North Orchard from the future land use map. I think Mike talked at the last meeting that thoroughfare plan is the general plan that guides those future potential roadway alignments. Ultimately, they are finally decided when property is developed. The city is not really in the practice of going out and building roadways. We have a hard enough time maintaining the ones we have. So those are just included in the future land use maps to help ensure that we have adequate circulation and mobility as the city grows and develops and as properties are proposed for subdivision, that those roadway corridors can be obtained. So as a result of that, he did not recommend any changes be made to the future land use map for that item.
Can I ask you a question along those lines? Because we were just talking about the area of city impact, and it seems like when you look at the map that a majority of those connectors are actually in the area of city impact. So how does that play out?
Well, the county's adopting that. So usually what happens, the property is annexed in the city for development, and then a subdivision plat's proposed, and we look at that subdivision and the street alignments in the subdivision to make sure that they're kind of hoping to achieve that overall circulation plan outlined on the thoroughfare plan and the future land use map. So the county did not have any problem adopting the future land use map that shows those future roadway alignments on it, so that is what was in the area city impact agreement.
Okay.
So nothing happens in the area city impact. We had that provision to provide comment on a building site, should it be right in the way of a road? And if it turns out that that's the only alignment that road could go through, we may ask that they shift that building site designation. But beyond that, that's guidance for when property is proposed for development, and we look at the roadway system that they're proposing and try to make sure that those roadway segments follow that plan.
And I believe that the particular mark on the map, which is being referred to here, was within the city limits.
Right.
Therefore.
But I was just looking,
Yeah.
when I saw the comment
Yeah.
and I went back and looked
Right.
at a lot of the
Right.
connectors are actually in the
They are.
area of city
So
impact. Yeah.
I'm in agreement with leaving the line on the map.
Yep.
Any subdivision that takes place on that property should have some road going through.
Well, and subdivisions tend to move a lot of dirt around and
Yeah.
topographies change, et cetera. I mean, that was the other
Yeah.
sort of factor in it.
And again, it'd be considered at the time of development. If it's deemed to be infeasible because of topography, we understand that, and we'll look for other ways to provide that same connection. believe Joanne Munita provided a comment regarding the 3rd and 6th Street designations, and that they be designated as collectors rather than arterials. I think the commission has talked about that in multiple meetings, as has the Transportation Commission, so Mike did not feel that any changes were warranted in response to that comment. Ms. Cheney provided comments, I think, on several areas. There are some grammatical suggestions and recommendations for rewording, and some recommendations related to recognizing the recent fluctuations in the recycling market. So I think Mike worked through most of the grammatical suggestions that she had made. I think there are some topical issues. I think one was suggesting that we use the 2010 census population numbers rather than the 2017 U.S. Census estimates. We felt 17 estimates were probably the most current numbers. Otherwise, we're using numbers that are nearly 10 years old. So we wanted to, I think we decided to retain using the 2017 estimates. Certainly once the 2020 census is complete and released in probably 21 or 22, we can update or reflect that. But I think for the time being, that's the most current information we have, so we felt no changes were necessary there. There was also some questions and recommendations related to climate change within the natural resources section. And Mike consulted with the staff liaison of the Sustainable Environment Commission, who felt there really were no additional changes that were necessary. SEC was comfortable with the language that was proposed and included in the plan, so no changes were made in response to that. For Chapter 2, I think there was a request to add references to the recently approved second location for New St. Andrews at the CJ's and the enrollment cap. We did add, I think Mike did amend to add a reference to that second location, but the enrollment cap is a condition of the CUP. That's kind of a detail that he didn't feel was necessary to have in the comp plan. So that change, so part of that change was made. Under Chapter 3, again, I think a similar request for 3rd and 6th to be changed from minor arterials to collectors. Again, the same question there. There were some additional comments related to additional proposed language related to downtown street trees, adding language related to the prior rejection of the bicycle parking ordinance, and questions related to the accuracy of the pedestrian ramp numbers. So the street classification is the same as Ms. Munita's comments, so no changes were made there. The additional language for downtown street trees or the bike parking rejection, Mike didn't feel really was necessary. I think he felt street trees were adequately covered. That was input received from the Tree Commission, and the prior bike parking ordinance failure was kind of history that he didn't feel was necessary to include it in the plan moving forward. He also contacted Public Works to confirm the pedestrian ramp numbers. They did confirm those were accurate, so he didn't change that. But he did modify some references for the Safe Routes to School program to include discussion of the project that occurred on Cleveland Street that was also suggested as well. So he made that change. For Chapter 4, I think the comment was to update the parks map to reflect the very recent change of the Eastgate Park name to Triangle Park, so he did change that on the maps. I think there were some other various parks and recreation comments. He forwarded that to Dwight Curtis to get his input, and he felt that the changes suggested were not appropriate at this time. They're still in the process of working on updating their Parks and Rec master plan, so he did not want to make the changes that were suggested at this time. So those changes were not made. So the maps were updated to reflect the name change, but the other amendments were not made. For Chapter 5, comments were received that appeared to recommend changes to the adopted PBAC water action plan and to update the recycling section to reflect the recent changes to single stream program. So the PBAC plan is their plan, so we're not recommending any changes to their action plan. So that request should be made to PBAC if individuals feel they need to make changes to the water action plan. The recycling section plan was updated as suggested. Under Chapter 6, I think the comment was received that a portion of the section appeared to read like an EMSI MC advertisement, and that a footnote should be added. We did not make any changes to that section. And I don't think Mike did not feel that the MZ comments were significant enough to add a footnote for that item. Chapter 7, I think there were a couple of comments and none of those changes were made. Mr. Hall provides some comments, again, regarding further conservation recommendations, changes to Figure 5.6, the PBAC Water Action Plan. And I think there were two sections that cited some water production numbers that were slightly different from each other. And also recommended changes to the aquifer diagram that was included in the plan, as there was a more current, more detailed version. I think one of the elements or one of the recommendations related to, recommending a prohibition of resale of city water, and that really is a city council decision. It's really not a land use decision from the commission. That is a water management and conservation decision, policy decision for the city council. So we didn't feel that was appropriate to include. The well production numbers were updated to match and are consistent in both sections. We also looked at whether we could utilize the updated aquifer cross-section map, but actually at the level of detail in that drawing, at the scale we have in the document, you couldn't read anything. And it's really, what we have is just a simplified version of the larger detailed version. So we really could not adopt that figure and make it work and be legible in the plan, so that was not modified. Mike did include mention of the surface water feasibility studies, so that was added to the document as well to reference that. And again, we could not make any changes to the PBAC Water Action Plan. He also walked through, I think, a few of the other comments with both environmental services and water department staff, and they did not feel the other suggested changes were warranted to make at this time. I think Mr. Peterson provided some comments and a fairly in-depth report, a global warming report, and requested that the comp plan language be strengthened on that topic. I think Mike talked with the Sustainable Environment Commission again, and I think felt that the language that was included in the plan was sufficient, that any greater level of detail really warranted a separate climate action plan, and that should not necessarily be within the comprehensive plan, and that should be a separate effort outside the land use planning document. So no additional changes were made there. And then Dawes made comments regarding some addition to goals in Chapter 5 regarding housing options. I think Mike reviewed that and felt that those goals were already reflected in Chapter 2, and that it would be redundant to actually include that in Chapter 5, so he did not make that change. There was also a comment received regarding recycling program, including exploring yard and food waste collection, reduction of single-use bags and containers, and giving residents digital options to reduce paper. That section has been updated to reflect some of those items. Some of those items are already available, and those should really probably be directed to the sanitation department, who is currently working through a sanitation master plan process, so we'll forward those contacts onto the sanitation department. And then we had several comment cards that were received. Many of those, I think Mike mentioned, address the transportation issues or beyond the scope of the comprehensive plan. So related to the transportation items, those changes were not made. And again, the housing availability options were already addressed. Those are really, we do discuss providing a variety of housing types for all of the residents in the community. So that's really addressed, and that's kind of more market driven about what products are largely available. So no changes were made there. So that kind of runs down, I think, the major comments or amendments that Mike has made to the document. And at this point, staff is seeking direction from the commission if you'd like to proceed with a public hearing. I think we had discussed previously moving forward with the public hearing sometime in January after the first of the year. Our first meeting actually falls fairly close to the holiday period. So I think it'd be best to stay with the second meeting in January just to get a little bit farther away from the holidays. So that would be on January 23rd. And with that, I would be happy to try to answer any questions of the
Any
commission.
questions from commissioners? For Bill? No? Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. I guess,
I'm generally in agreement with the changes made or not made by staff, so I'm pleased with what I'm hearing.
it seems like it was a good response, and that many of the concerns expressed actually fall into master plans in other commissions or city departments' jurisdiction, and so we're more general in a sense,
Yeah, I mean, recycling programs is really not a land use issue. I mean, it's a community issue, and we have actually a very in-depth and detailed comprehensive plan, much more so than we've had in the past. And so the tendency is for everybody to want to put more into it.
Layer more in,
And,
yeah.
and there are guiding plans for the utilities, there are guiding plans for the recycling program, there are guiding plans for Parks and Recreation. Those are really the much more specific documents that address those particular functions, programs, or activities. These are overarching goals, but getting into some of those levels of details really is not where the comp plan.
So there, questions about housing choices or affordability, the Fair and Affordable Housing Commission, do they have an action plan also? Or
Well,
is that where some of those comments should be directed?
They can't, I mean, the question is that, the city has some limited capability of addressing those
Right,
challenges.
because
right?
you're not developers, yeah.
Yeah, and inclusionary housing requirements are illegal in the state of Idaho, so you cannot require the construction of affordable housing or a certain number of units to be affordable. We tried to be flexible in our zoning and have allowed twin homes, townhouses, accessory dwelling units, all the things. We've reduced setbacks, lot sizes, increased building heights. We've done everything we can to try to promote the efficiency in construction and land, and hopefully that would help drive down and reduce housing cost and development cost. But there are a lot of factors and inputs that we don't have direct controls on, and we don't have a large source of subsidy to try to address that issue either. The Fair and Affordable Housing Commission worked on that, and I worked with them as staff liaison at the time for a number of years, and the outcome of that was to create the Moscow Affordable Housing Trust as a community housing development organization that gets them into the pipeline for federal home dollars to do affordable housing development. But that was kind of the extent of what we felt we could do at that point in time. The Partnership for Economic Prosperity and the city and the county are partnering on a housing study for the Palouse right now. And we will see what comes of that and what recommendations may come forward. But, we discuss affordability, we discuss housing options. We've done a number of zoning code amendments, and we've approved a number of very compact PUDs, on lots as small as 1,600 square feet to try to promote compact, low-cost, land efficient, and hopefully affordable housing in the community. But what we can do much beyond that is somewhat limited. And so we do try to provide all of that within the zoning code. I mean, we can make sure we have the framework that provides for a wide variety of housing options within our zoning districts. At some point, though, it's up to the developer in the market to put a product out there.
Right. Are there any questions? Anywhere?
Sounds very consistent to what we talked about in detail.
Okay, so, and I guess we should, it doesn't seem like there's any further direction, so we'll just set up for the public hearing. Because I don't think we need to take a vote, so we're good. Okay, thank you. And so now you're going to stay up there again, Bill, and you're going to tell us about small cell wireless facilities report.
Hopefully something a little more interesting, or maybe not. So this, I'll provide a little bit of background here, but this is kind of the upcoming wave of wireless communication that we're expecting. It's going to have some impacts to us, both in the community we expect, as well as drive some need to modernize our telecommunications ordinance in the zoning code, or standards for telecommunications facilities. So just a little bit of background. Historically, cellular communication systems were designed just to transport voice communications. And obviously, with everybody's smartphone that you have in your pocket, data has become increasingly heavy demand upon mobile devices and users. Those voice communications were more easily handled with very tall, high-power communication towers. So those are the big, tall ones you'd see. They could blast for many miles and carry that voice communication fairly well. While that works fairly well for voice, it does not work well for data, and data degrades over that distance. And so what we're going to see in the future is shifting to smaller towers in highly populated urban areas to try to deliver that data service and the next rollout of the 5G that we expect to see. So as that technology has evolved, that wireless data demand has overwhelmed the historical large tower system. That new 5G deployment that's started last year, and it's going to be more largely rolled out in the coming year, will bring much higher data speed and much higher data loads. And so many wireless carriers are starting to begin substantial investments, and have for a number of years in the high population urban centers. We're a little bit low on the list here at 25,000 in north central Idaho. But they've been doing it in the urban centers, and we've been beginning to get inquiries from providers and companies recently here. So to meet that need and that demand, they're going to go to these small cell installations. So what we've historically seen for cell tower installations in Moscow, and here are kind of two examples. This is the Verizon tower located behind the East Side Marketplace. So a fairly traditional non-stealth tower installation, or this one here up off of C Street near the Emmanuel Lutheran Church is a monopole stealth tower there. But historically, those have been the cell tower type installations that we have, and I think we've got 3 standalone towers in town. We have the one here behind the east side. We have this one, as I mentioned, up on C Street, and then we have one on South Main by the Creekside Housing Project. So those have been really the 3 cell towers we've had installed. Luckily, we've had a lot of tall buildings and tall water tanks that have taken the role of towers in town. Theophilus Tower is probably one of the most decorated structures in town. If you take a look at the roof, it doesn't really come clear here, but they have about 9 to 12 antennas on each side of that building. So Theophilus has long held a large number of cell antennas. The McConnell building doesn't actually show up here, but if you look at it from Main Street, you'll see some antennas sticking up. Verizon has an installation on top of the McConnell building. And we've also our water reservoirs. The one up on Residence Street is the one on Orchard and F have carried 3 to 4 carriers on each of the water tanks, as well as some other accessory antennas. So many of our antenna installations have been accommodated on existing structures, but that's not going to be the future for the small cell installations. So, as I mentioned, a lot of that voice data goes to the tall towers, and they'll continue to serve that role in carrying voice traffic. But the small cells will be installed in a much higher density in order to address the data communication from the mobile devices. And while these can be, several miles, many miles apart, these small cells really need to be about every 500 feet. So it's almost like having your Wi-Fi hotspot and your router in your house, essentially every 500 feet through the community to provide that service. It has a somewhat small antenna. Usually a typical installation is a fiber optic feed to every small node location. From there, they may have ground equipment, or that equipment may be in a cabinet attached to the pole. Goes up to the antennas that are located on top of the pole. And the FCC has defined small cells as being any tower less than 50 feet in height, and then certain volume restrictions for both the antenna and equipment size. So that's kind of the typical breakdown and structure of a small cell antenna. This is an installation actually from Vancouver, Washington, which is the before, which is a utility pole, which is where we expect to see many of these placed. And then this is the before, and this is the photo simulation of after, where they attached an equipment structure here with an antenna sticking above the top of the pole as it existed previously. So that's kind of one example of what they would likely look like. They can also be installed on light poles and luminaires. So here are a couple examples of one on top of a light pole here and on top of a dual head luminaire as well. A couple other examples here. This was in Central Park, I think also in New York City as well. Kind of a standalone installation where it's got a wide base where the equipment's in the base of the pole, and then the antenna's on top. And some of these have, I think this probably has a luminaire also off to the side.
So is the sense that within a city, the communication within the city is more dense? I can't, my little head can't get around if we want to send a bunch of stuff, a bunch of movies and other things and soccer matches and stuff from far away, then I don't quite understand what the little guys in the middle of the city, unless the presumption is that most of the traffic is kind of within a city.
Well, so every installation is going to be backhauled on a fiber connection, and that fiber will run back to a main node, and that'll connect into the carrier's system beyond that. So everything will come from the internet, through that central hub, through the individual fiber line to that small node that will serve, let's say, that block. And they're anticipating that your future internet service is going to be your 5G modem you set in your windowsill that's communicating with that small node tower that's outside your home, and that the convergence of video, voice, and data delivery will be happening on that 5G network in the future.
So what happens to rural areas?
Well, rural areas have always struggled with data service. And even with voice service, I mean, depending upon your carrier, that's a question. But for us, we're looking at what's coming our way.
There'll still be 3G towers out in rural areas?
I'm expecting they'll still maintain that. This will be to supplement in the higher density urban areas where they have higher customer traffic. Now, one of the challenges, or one of the primary concerns that have been voiced by a lot of municipalities is that if these are not managed in some way, you can end up with a fair amount of visual clutter.
And it affects the tree canopy too.
You could have an impact there, but it's, just the kind of the visual appearance of having 4 or 5 carriers on a single utility pole and making it look like quite a mess. So that is a concern that many communities have voiced. I mean, if you look back at some of those, these obviously look fairly clean, fairly nice. I don't really see these as being objectionable in any way. But having this outside your window or in front of your house looking out may not be the best thing, best view you would like to have. Now, there are some limitations under the Telecommunications Act, local jurisdictions, and there's a different aspect to this. Historically, we've had a greater opportunity to regulate private land use, and typically the large towers are installed on private land, and we have a conditional use permit and review it, and you have a public hearing. Underneath the Telecommunications Act, local jurisdictions have to grant telecommunications providers access to the public rights-of-way. And so many of these installations are going to be happening, or most of them likely, in the public right-of-way on existing utility poles, light poles, or other locations. And we cannot deny access to the public right-of-way to those providers. So it's going to change the nature of the discussion. Historically, as I mentioned, so that's kind of the same comment. We also cannot regulate the installation of telecommunications providers based on potential concerns about radio frequency emissions and health effects. That has been prohibited by the FCC, and local governments cannot regulate cell towers or small cells or others based on the concerns of health effects. That is not legally allowed underneath the Telecommunications Act. The FCC also just recently issued new rulings at the end of September, came out I think on September 26th, that were intended to streamline the permitting process for 5G small cell deployments across the country. So the ruling included a number of things, the first of which is the maximum fee that can be charged for small cell applications and right-of-way use. So they have established fees, and I think it was roughly no more than $500 for the application fee, and I think it was about $75 per year for right-of-way use per small cell antenna installation. In doing some research, I've found communities that were charging like $5,000 per small cell installation for the application and review fee. So they say, and what the FCC did not actually set maximum fees, but they set what they called safe harbor fees. That is, if you don't charge any more than this, you will not be at risk of being sued. If you charge anything more than this safe harbor fee, then you better be able to document that that's a cost that you were actually incurred in permitting and reviewing the application. So they have kind of the effect of setting a maximum fee, but really it's just the safe harbor fee. The FCC also set new shot clock decision timeframes for the installations of small cells. So if it's a co-location on an existing utility pole, we have 60 days to approve or deny the application. And if it's a standalone small cell tower, the city would have 90 days to make a decision. So we have a time frame, and if you fail to act within that time frame, then the carrier can file a complaint with the FCC that you're obstructing their access to the marketplace, and it goes on from there. So it's clear the FCC is intending to try to help facilitate that process. There is a new appeal process for shot clock violations. So the FCC is very committed to trying to promote the rollout of 5G service across the country. And so some of these rulings that they've made have intended to try to help facilitate that effort. So there are a number of recommendations that have been made to local governments. Small cells are coming, and communities will not have the ability to exclude them from all areas, because that would effectively preclude their entry into the marketplace, which is prohibited underneath the Telecommunications Act, and we have to grant reasonable access to the right-of-way. So they're going to be coming. It's recommended that communities either stay with the safe harbor fee maximums or clearly document the basis of their fees to support them. There are recommendations that communities establish clear aesthetic standards to regulate the number of attachments per pole to avoid the clutter issue. to require shielding and shrouding of equipment to hide the antennas and equipment so that they're either match the pole or, aren't obtrusive. They also are recommending location and spacing requirements to avoid cluttering and over-concentration of antennas. Most of them have adopted, they cannot be any closer than 250 feet from each other, just to kind of get them spread out, as well as developing a permitting and review process that allows the jurisdiction to process the applications within that shot clock time to avoid potential litigation on those violations. I looked through, so these are some diagrams from Denver's. So many of the large urban areas have adopted these. They adopted really, most of the ones I found were adopted in 2018 in advance of this rollout. So these are just a couple standard drawings from Denver's standards. It just shows kind of the power feed and fiber feed. There's usually a utility meter because you have to have power to service the equipment and the antennas. So there's going to be a disconnect and a utility meter installation. You may have an equipment shelter located lower on the pole and then cabling going up to the antenna location. So that's kind of
How
one.
high off the ground? I mean, so somebody walking down the street at night, would they crash into the?
Well,
I mean, how?
so that's one of the questions, and one of the
Yeah.
concerns is to make sure the equipment placement does not overhang the sidewalk
Sidewalk,
or obstruct the sidewalk, for example, or to have minimum clearances for that equipment. So those are all part of the elements we would develop for those installation standards. Sometimes the antennas can be suspended from a strand, so there's a cable wire that would suspend and hold the antennas if there wasn't maybe not clearance or room to have the antenna on the utility pole itself. This is another example of maybe it's just a luminaire pole, so it does not have power service, but maybe has a power drop just through the luminaire, and they have an antenna, which they call a cantenna. So it's not a cantina, but a cantenna, where the antenna's in a circular shroud shield on top of the pole to kind of match almost the same diameter as the pole, so it visually blends in. Again, you have power and fiber optic service coming up the pole. That power meter disconnect, equipment shelter, maybe it's a side mounted, maybe it's a top mounted. Most of the standards that I came across recommended no more than 2 shroud enclosures on the pole, and that could be, an equipment shroud and then the antenna shroud, so it gets one installation largely per pole. So that's just kind of a typical maybe luminaire installation, a ground-fed freestanding light luminaire with an antenna on top. This is another typical detail. And a lot of the larger communities are just coming out and swapping out pole fixtures, light fixtures, with ones that have the antenna on top and just doing a direct replacement to do those. Oftentimes those will have an equipment cabinet in the base of the pole, and then the antenna will sit on top. And they'll have a power meter that'll stick out the side of the pole for the utility company to read. Similar detail, just possibly with a side-mounted antenna if it wasn't on top, or maybe the equipment is up at a higher elevation on the pole there, but just kind of a couple different examples of what they have as approved typical installation diagrams for Denver. And then this is just a standalone, so sometimes it may be there's no utility pole that's suited. It's an area with underground utility service. Maybe there's not a light pole in the right location. So you might see these standalone, small-scale cell towers. Again, the equipment cabinet in the base with the antenna on top. So for as I mentioned, kind of our telecommunications regulations are really for the old historical tall towers. The objectives stated in our code are to minimize the number of antenna towers, which was the primary focus of the way the code works. To encourage co-location of telecommunication facilities, again, to minimize the number of towers. To encourage the use of buildings, again, to minimize towers. And to encourage that they're located and designed to minimize visual impact to the community and the surrounding areas. And the other stated objective, which was to comply with the FCC standards and the Telecommunications Act at the time, was to ensure the regulation of the telecommunications facilities does not have the effect of prohibiting the provision of telecommunication services, does not unreasonably discriminate among functionally equivalent providers or such services, and allows the provision of adequate area coverage by such services. So those are our current stated objectives leading into our telecommunications code. For our new antenna towers, really in all zoning districts, it is a conditionally permitted use. Antenna towers that are over 60 feet in height are not permitted within 500 feet of the highway right-of-ways for 95 or State Highway 8. unless they're located in the university, motor business, or industrial zoning districts. If they are in those districts, they have to be at least 100 feet away from the public, from the right-of-way of those highways. In other districts, tower setback is equal to the tower height of the tower, or to residential uses, or half of the height to other uses. They're not to be lit unless it's required to be so by FAA. There's a noise limitation for any associated equipment for the tower. They're to be neutral color with matching color cables and antennas. Ground equipment in residential areas has to be contained by a masonry wall to screen them from view. Can be a slatted fence and landscaping in other zoning districts. We do require one parking stall for maintenance, equipment, and personnel, and any above-ground ancillary facilities are required to be located 25 to 50 feet from residential property boundaries, depending upon the zoning district that the tower is located within. We also have a provision within that process to notice other telecommunications providers. So if we have a company proposing a tower that we require them to send out notice to all the other telecommunications providers in the area to let them know this tower is going up and to provide them an opportunity to co-locate on that tower at that time. So that's, again, just to try to encourage that co-location and to minimize how many towers are constructed in town. We also require them to sign a commitment to allow co-location on their tower with other providers under reasonable terms and conditions. So that's also a requirement in the code today. Co-locations we define to be a placement of an antenna upon existing support structure, and that's any structure or building not constructed primarily for the purpose of supporting antenna. So co-locations are really where I think we expect many of these small cell installations to fall underneath our code, with the goal in the past of trying to minimize towers. Co-location was allowed as a use by right in all zoning districts. But there are some standards that the antenna cannot project more than 18 feet above or 8 feet away horizontally from that support structure in residential districts. It may project further in commercial zoning districts. And this is going to be one of those questions of, if it's a 30 or 35 foot tall utility pole, 18 feet above that's you're almost half the height of that or more of the pole. And so our current co-location language probably is not going to work for small cell installations. Most communities limit the small cell antenna height to no more than 5 feet, the height of the support structure that it's on. So that's enough for the shrouding and the mounting equipment for the antenna on top of the light pole or on top of the utility pole. 18 feet, that was pretty liberal. We were anticipating that's going on a water tower or building or something larger. But on top of a utility pole, that's going to be a fairly large extension. So we probably need to look at that. 8 feet away is also quite a ways horizontally from a utility pole for the visual impact. So our co-location language, as it currently exists in the code, probably is not going to work well for the small cell installations. And since that's going to be the primary method of installation, we probably need to look at modifying those standards. For us, we would expect small cell, the program objectives would be to provide that reasonable access for the desired services to the residents. We would like to minimize that visual clutter upon utility poles and make sure that they are done and installed well and aesthetically pleasing. We want to ensure that those installations do not obstruct sidewalks and roadways and do not interfere with light fixture function. So again, that question Wendy you had about the equipment, we don't want it to obstruct the sidewalk or create an ADA access issue or to be too low over a street and create obstructions. We want to make sure that we get proper clearances for those installations. And we also need to create that permitting system that can facilitate processing those applications within the allotted time periods underneath the SEC's new ruling. We do need to coordinate, obviously, with utility and owners. Most of the street lights and utility poles in town are going to be owned by Avista. There are some number of poles that are going to be owned by Frontier, and the city owns some light fixtures in town. And so we're going to have to kind of coordinate the installations with all of the owners of the support structures. So kind of our next steps, just to kind of brief, this is more or less a briefing tonight, is that we've set up kind of initial coordination meeting, be at the end of next week with all the departments who will be involved in the process, kind of let them know of the SCC ruling, our permitting timeframe, kind of talk about, Public Works will be involved largely in that right-of-way permitting and the right-of-way use permits and tracking the installations and charging the fees and processing them. So we want to make sure that we have a system in place. Whether they come next year or the year after or next week, we want to try to get a system in place that can address that. We want to establish that program outline, those general parameters to address the right-of-way use conflicts, access standards and requirements with the federal standards. We'd like to update our zoning code to kind of establish some of those aesthetic standards, some of the co-locations requirements for those small cell installations as well. So make sure that we have that in place. And ultimately, that will move on to this body for any of the zoning code amendments for your review and recommendation to the city council and on from there. So that's all I had this evening, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Joel?
Is there any relationship between what we're talking about here and the proposal that the Board of Adjustment faced a couple of weeks ago?
No,
Was that a tall tower or a?
That was your typical tower
Okay.
height. I think it was an 80-foot tower on that site.
Yeah. So following on then, do we then need to retain tall tower ordinance as well as short tower ordinance?
Yes. In my opinion, we just need to develop new small cell standards, and it'll match the FCC antenna size, equipment volume standards. So if you're in that size category, I mean, this is equipment that can fit in, a 24 by 16 cabinet, not a hut on the ground like your traditional high power cell towers would have. So
it sort of feeds back to my question about what happens in rural areas. It seems at least possible that the tall towers may continue to serve long-distance rural areas.
And tall towers will continue to serve voice traffic. It's much easier to hand off, I think, on 5-mile increments than every 500 feet for that voice
Yeah.
traffic. So I really think, the small cells are largely intended to handle that data load. And the rural areas are probably not likely to see 5G service anytime in the near future.
Right. So we have to deal with the tall towers for them.
Questions, anybody?
Seems like an opportunity, Bill, for the city to set a standard and work with Avista to
Yeah.
replace a lot of the outdated lighting,
Yeah,
like the cabinet style.
yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
So from your diagram, the installing them on top of the luminaries seems pretty clean versus going to the utility poles looked really cluttered. And like it would interfere with, those are going to be by yards, the utility poles, and so then you're going to have fences and trees and all kinds of things there too.
Yeah,
And those guys climb up the pole, whereas the luminaries, they're in the bucket truck.
And Avista's been hit pretty hard in the Spokane market on this already, and I've already contacted to get in touch with the joint use group and sit down and talk about kind of what are their standards they've adopted so that we can take that information in. It is a little bit, if you look at, on a utility pole, that's going to be additional equipment hanging on it. Certainly, if you had an underground service luminaire with an antenna on top and equipment cabinet, that's going to be your cleanest installation. That's going to be the most aesthetically pleasing installation. Unfortunately, we have a large number of wood utility poles that serve as luminaire poles throughout town in the older neighborhoods. It's really not until you get to the newer residential areas that have underground utility services that you have those. So we would expect to see some of these. Now, maybe the top antenna is the preference rather than having a side mount, but I think we'll have to, every situation is going to be different. This may be interfering with the tree canopy, so this may be the best option in that installation. So I think we're going to probably have to accommodate a variety of installation methods. The primary goal is just to try to avoid that clutter picture. That's kind of what we'd probably not like to see. And that's some of the early rollouts before communities had standards in place ended up with things like that. And I think that's really the primary thing we'd be trying to avoid here is something like that.
So what is that? Is that just different businesses putting?
That's like 3 or 4 different carriers, their
Okay.
equipments, and there are different antennas on it.
Yeah.
One of the context we've had recently is a company so for us, we're a pretty small rural market. It's going to be tough for a carrier to make that kind of investment and make it pay on a population of 25,000. But the contact we've had is actually from a carrier's carrier, which is a company that goes out and builds the infrastructure and then carries multiple cell providers' traffic on their network, delivers it to their nodes, and then gets it back on their network. That's a much more likely scenario, is somebody that can get service to Sprint and T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon all in one network and make that investment pay off. And so that's the company that's made the initial contact. And so that's what I expect we would see. I don't know that's going to happen immediately, but they're making after the FCC ruling, which they've been kind of waiting on, they've been starting to make contacts. And in a period of a month, we've had about 4 different contacts related to telecommunications, whether it's fiber optic installation in the right of way or it's small cell installations or others. So we do expect this coming in the near future.
Are these the same companies that you've seen before, or will there be new people that you've never seen?
Well, we're getting contacted by their consultants and their attorneys. So we don't know actually who's behind it other than the one consultant that disclosed who their client was. But I think a lot of these companies are hiring consulting firms to go out and do the initial legwork and probably to try to lay claim on locations to avoid the competition. For us, I don't think that's going to be necessarily an issue. I think the company that's...
But is it as in Verizon,
It's not.
AT&T?
It's
or
not.
somebody else?
It is a carrier's carrier. It's going to be somebody who's carrying traffic from multiple providers. And that's what I expect we're going to see, is that, because that's just going to be a much more economical or financially feasible model than just one carrier trying to make that kind of deployment, which actually works in our favor. That means you don't have the multiple installations. Maybe you only have one company that's carrying for multiple carriers.
You know, in a sense, I'm going to open up a can of worms probably here, but you look at the national debate with the FCC over net neutrality and equal access versus the right to throttle. And some states, like the state of Washington, has said, no, you can't do that inside of our state, even though the feds say you can nationwide. And that could be carried down to the city level, too. And what strikes me is that we have these private cell towers on private property, but now they want to use the public right-of-way, and it really becomes much more in the domain of a public utility. Is it okay to spend more electricity to your house than my house? I mean, to me, it's like, could the city potentially actually adopt a net neutrality law that goes with this?
It's going to be beyond me, but they do it already. Telecommunications is on the cables through every right-of-way, and they are controlling your traffic right
okay.
now anyhow. It's just a different method of delivery. It's just different last mile.
Well, they haven't started throttling yet, but it's out there. It's ready to happen.
I believe it's happening to me.
Is it happening? Well, that might explain a few problems in getting your comprehensive plan downloaded.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things happening in the
Yeah,
background.
actually, I was trying to download the comprehensive plan today, and it's solved.
No, it took me 3 tries, yeah.
But I mean, they're using those rights of way today, and whether it's cable providers, whether it's the Spectrum or it's Frontier, or they're delivering you services and they're offering you tiered plans. You want to pay more, they won't throttle you back. Others, they're gonna start once you hit a certain threshold. So they're doing it already.
One of the great benefits of living out on Moscow Mountain is they still have telephone lines.
Yeah. Well, any other questions? Wow. Yeah, that's quite so we're going to be busy with at least reviewing what you all propose, so.
Do you imagine that can you foresee in the next year that we would get maybe a subcommittee or something to work on this issue, or do you think it'll be easier than that?
I want to move I want to move faster than that, because I don't want to get caught.
Yeah. I can see that.
I want to get an initial draft in place, and then if we need to refine, we can take some time to do it. I mean, this is not something that I think warrants a moratorium or anything like that, and actually, we wouldn't be allowed. We've got a 60-day clock if it's a co-location. We can't do that. So my goal is actually to get, and I've got a draft already done, but that's my initial cut, and I want to reach out to the communications providers and work with Public Works and get the permitting process lined up. So I've got an initial draft I've already put together. It just took about a day to do, because it's really fairly basic. Really, it's not that complicated. So I'd like to get that in place, and if there are further actions we think are necessary, then we can take time, but at least get the basic protections in place, and then we can take some more time from there.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess, does anybody else have any other business? Just a reminder that we don't meet again, right, in December. We meet again
Correct.
January 9th, I think.
January 9th.
January 9.
And we're going to have, among other things, just that little shared reading piece on conservation subdivisions on the book I handed out. And also, I think Mike is planning to invite somebody from, and I honestly can't remember which commission, but to join our discussion. I'll have to talk to him, so. But,
Unless you'd like to meet on December 26th, we can do that.
no, we really don't need to. No, I think, right, okay, it was December 20, I knew it was
Day after Christmas.
close to Christmas, yeah. All right, Merry Christmas, or Happy Holidays to everybody, and thank you. So,